Well, I think it is a good move, and I'll tell you why. But the only fear is that, a stimulus like this shouldn't be designed to just raise, irrational exuberance in the short run. So it has to be done right. Now, what exactly does, doing stimulus right mean? Over the last 3 years since this government has taken over, there is an attempt to get after black economy. They're trying to get after corruption. They're trying to formalize, digitize, all those efforts really. And of course, then there's the uncertainty of the GST, which is a good move, but it takes time for people to adapt to these new systems. Now, that uncertainty has to be now countered by, the government coming ahead and supporting, to sort of offset some of this, and rather have, short-run irrational exuberance. They must really now think of kinds of spend that will lead to growth and job creation. I think at the end of the day, that becomes one of the, main objectives. And here, I think the mood of the nation would be, in terms of the private sector, it would be raised tremendously if the message went out that it's okay to make profits and the government is really going to get out of the way, divestment, get rid of Air India, ITDC, some of these moves perhaps could even finance the stimulus, would really then set the tone, to really achieve the long-term objective of a stimulus like this. Right. But one thing we are sort of missing in this entire discussion is that none of these things, the stimulus or a cut in the interest rate, mind you, is a substitute for actually improving the ease of doing business in this country. And while the government has been investing and trying in a lot of structural reforms, and again GST and all of those, they do add to uncertainty. But we really haven't, come down hammer and tong in making, the ease of doing business environment more business friendly, which means faster compliances, smoother permits, all kinds of applications which take months. The recent Niti Aayog IDFC Institute survey showed that, businesses take months to get certain clearances and construction permits, etc. Now, if on the ground those things are not really getting improved, then like I said before, a stimulus of this nature is only going to lead to, a part-time, what I call irrational exuberance in the market, because it's going to be very difficult to sustain that. So one, we have to get down to the ease of doing business issues, like real nuts and bolts of doing business, getting a lot of these regulatory hurdles out of the way, simplifying procedures, and that is really, none of this. And the second is really raising the mood overall. And raising the mood overall is not just done by government spending, and I think the intent has to be there, and this is where some large ticket, some big bang divestment is required. No, actually, the public sector banks that we talk about as if it's one large bucket and they're all homogeneous entities. It would be good for the sake of transparency, again, because it's taxpayers' money which is, going to be used for this, to be sure that we are not just postponing this crisis further by, infusing small amounts of money into a large number of poorly performing banks. It would be good to see some details of forensics which is being carried out. It should be okay to let some of these banks which have particularly performed bad because of either the due diligence or just poor nature of its governance. It's okay to let some of these banks fail, in my opinion. And I again think it goes towards, it will correct the mood in the nation. I mean, the idea being that, the government means business. And some of the banks which have relatively performed well, and though might be sitting with NPAs, but not all of it is really on account of poor decision making or bad governance. I think those banks should be the ones prioritized for this kind of support. Because, there is this excellent research that one of the deputy governors of RBI, Viral Acharya, he has a recent paper, which basically says that, if you keep infusing these small amounts, what you're going to see is these banks making, more and more ghost loans to basically showcase that, the accounts are actually, the strength of the bank is intact. And that might really just lead to further postponements. So I think forensics and a little more transparency on the nature of each of these banks is quite required. I wouldn't say that in blanket just give them the money. Absolutely. In fact, while we have been talking a great deal in, I would say, the last 1 decade or so, the emphasis has still very much been on, stimulating larger firms. In fact, within the MSME again, the micro enterprises require a very different reform strategy than your small and medium. And again, we are going back to those fundamental factors about ease of doing business. It is not, well, financing is obviously one constraint. And this stimulus, if it is targeted towards that sector, it will, in the short run, achieve some of the objectives. But again, we have to remove these hurdles. It should become easier for these guys to start and wind up business and expand business and so on. So again, compliances and permits and all these certificates, we have, the government beyond financing, I think, and this is really the back-end grunge work, where I think there was an earlier point made in the program by one of the panelists, that this is where the states come in. The states have to now really break down these procedures of, what we look at in the life cycle of a firm, and try to make things easy for this space, the MSME space, because for these guys to maneuver the regulatory framework becomes very costly. Unlike larger firms, which the cost of relocation, etc., is relatively easier for them. They are able to raise finances on relatively better terms. This is a sector which, essentially operates, on higher costs, even vis-a-vis, not just labor, because there are a lot of, labor reforms which are still being talked about, and many states have not really experimented with or brought on the table, but also access to finance.
Right.
This is a sector which must be prioritized, again, from the job creation perspective. Now, this is where, the problem is that even during the time when we had massive growth,
Right.
of manufacturing and so on, even within the organized sector, most of the employment created was informal in nature,
Right.
or contractual in nature. So now I don't know what will be the nature of the data that you're going to analyze to then say that it is the SMEs indeed which are leading to expansion in employment or whatever.
Right.
But this is a sector much in need of not just credit, but ease in the,
doing business.
reform, overall regulatory framework.